Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Tom Cabassi. I'm the UK Director of IPPR. I'd like to say how delighted we are that we have the First Minister speaking this morning, and to say a very warm welcome to all of you. This is actually part of a series of events that IPPR is doing on where now after the vote to leave the European Union. We have had events in London and also events here in Scotland. In fact, we kicked off the series here in Scotland just a few weeks ago. So I'm not going to take much more of your time. I'm just going to say a very big thank you to all of you for joining us, and to hand over to our Director of IPPR Scotland, Russell Gunson, who's going to give some introductory remarks to our speaker today. So thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you, Tom, for that introduction. The last few weeks have been unprecedented, I'm sure we'll all agree, in their importance and their flux. And it's clear, as if it wasn't before, that all of us in this room are living through some of the most important times to face Scotland and the UK. Given its importance, the question of what happens next is one that I believe all of us, in whatever way we can, have a contribution to make. And we need to support our politics and our decision makers through these momentous times. I just wanted to say a few words from IPPR Scotland's perspectives before introducing the First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, our speaker today. Firstly, I want to make clear that IPPR Scotland starts from the basis that the mandate from the people of Scotland was clear, with a significant majority in favour of Scotland staying in the EU. Everything now should be done by the Scottish and UK governments to explore the full range of options that would meet that mandate. And in our view, without question, therefore, the EU vote reopens the constitutional question in Scotland. To me, that seems obvious and undeniable. However, how can that clear mandate from the people of Scotland be met? We've heard a number of times from the new UK Prime Minister that Brexit means Brexit. But at this stage, we're unclear as to what that means for the UK, never mind for Scotland. And equally in Scotland, there are many who believe just as forcefully that a Remain means a Remain. And as much effort now needs to be put into what a Remain could look like for Scotland as to what a Brexit could look like for the UK. What is possible and what is desirable from a progressive point of view will require urgent work and research, and IPPR is well placed, if not best placed, to take on this challenge and support this crucial debate. I should say, of course, that IPPR Scotland has no position on independence. We're neutral. We're a progressive, cross-party think tank, and will guard that status jealously now and into the future. We weren't around at the time of the 2014 referendum, but clearly, independence for Scotland may be one way to meet the multiple mandates offered up by the EU vote. We stand ready to support any debate on Scotland's future, whether that leads to Scotland in or out of the UK, or in or out of the EU. But even from this neutral standpoint, it's clear that it's for those across the UK, including in Scotland, that don't want to see independence for Scotland, or those that wish to explore all the options, to come forward with alternatives and answer some key questions. So, for example, how can a Brexit protect Scotland's key relationships with our EU partners, whether in terms of freedom of movement of people, the goods and services produced in Scotland, or in terms of protection for some of the most crucial industries and sectors based in Scotland? And it's not just about protecting Scotland's interests. Any Brexit that includes Scotland will likely just as much be about protecting Scotland's values, upholding through all our dealings with the wider world human rights, democracy, the environment, social justice, and an open, welcoming, outward-looking worldview. How can a Brexit deliver that for Scotland? And of course, underneath all of this is the question of how the UK would need to change to accommodate this type of tailored Brexit, with a stronger role for Scotland and potentially Northern Ireland and other parts of the UK on the world stage. Just answering one of these questions would be a huge challenge. However, to answer all of these in the time we have before any Brexit, we'll need a passion and a dedication to getting this right, not just in Scotland, but across the UK too, and not just from the Scottish Government, but from the UK Government too. And we will see whether this is forthcoming. But let me be clear from our point of view, if it is not, then Scotland's options will narrow significantly. The future of Europe is so very clearly the overriding question facing Scotland, the UK and Europe just now. And it's why IPPR has moved so quickly to bring together a UK-wide series of events on the future of our relationship with Europe. And given Scotland's importance to this debate, it's no coincidence that we're here for the second time to hear from Nicola Sturgeon on the future of Scotland and Europe. If Scotland has been at the epicentre of some of the most interesting and challenging times in recent years, then it is without question that Nicola Sturgeon has been at the centre of that political life throughout. Following one of the most successful and smooth leadership transitions in modern political history, unprecedented in the UK at least, and the SNP's huge successes in the 2015 Westminster elections and May's Scottish Parliament elections, Nicola has been a politician at the very top of her game on both the Scottish and UK stage. A rare exception at a time when trust, respect, and faith in politicians is a vanishingly rare commodity. This is perhaps displayed never more so than in the principled, dignified, and above all, statesperson-like response in the hours and days following the EU referendum itself. So we're delighted to have you all here today to hear what I'm sure will be a fascinating insight into the future of Scotland and Europe. And it's now my great pleasure to welcome Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland.
Thank you very much indeed, Russell, for that introduction. Thank you to you too, Tom, for opening this event today, and my sincere thanks to IPPR Scotland for hosting this event today. And lastly, thank you to all of you for coming along here this morning to hear what I have to say and to ask me questions or make the observations you will choose to make after my remarks this morning. It is a real pleasure for me to be here at this forum today to speak about Scotland's place in Europe. We are now, of course, exactly 1 month on from the EU referendum. It seems in some ways no time at all, and in other ways a lifetime. And I'm sure many of you feel exactly the same way. Today I want to reflect on the result, on how I felt and what some of the lessons might be. I'll try to give you an insight into my own thoughts and feelings and how that thinking developed in the early hours of the 24th of June and in the days since. I'll then consider where we are now and what lies ahead, and I'll root this firmly in Scotland's interests and indeed our values. What are our interests? Why do they matter? And how will we seek to protect them in a way that, as far as possible, unites us? I also hope to demonstrate that the question of Scotland's place in the EU, just like that of Scotland's place in the UK, is not some constitutional abstraction or distraction. It is fundamentally about how we best equip ourselves to deal with the complex, interdependent challenges facing governments, businesses and individuals in the 21st century. It is about jobs and the economy. It's about living standards, fairness and equality. And it's about our place in and our contribution to the world. It matters for and to all of us. And as we navigate our way through the difficult weeks, months and indeed years that lie ahead of us, that is what I think we must all bear in mind. Firstly though, let me take you back to the result, back to the morning of Friday the 24th of June. Every generation has its "do you remember where you were when" moments. I suspect this is going to be one of ours. We'll all remember for a very, very long time exactly where we were and indeed how we felt when we heard the result of the EU referendum. Some of you will have woken up to the news, having gone to bed a few hours earlier, assured that the polls, the bookies and the markets were all pointing firmly in the direction of a Remain vote. Others, like me, will have watched events unfold right through the night, and many, again like me, will have experienced that horrible sinking feeling as the early results started to come in. I told the Scottish Parliament a few days later that I was disappointed and concerned by the result. I have to admit to you today that was parliamentary language for a much stronger feeling. I felt angry that Scotland faced the prospect of being taken out of the EU against our will, with all the damaging consequences that would entail. I felt, and still feel, contempt for a Leave campaign that had lied and given succour to the racism and intolerance of the far right. I felt frustration on behalf of people, not just in Scotland, but across the UK, at the political irresponsibility that had brought us to that point. Now, I'm sure it won't surprise you to hear that I'm the last person you will ever hear criticising the principle of referenda. But, and this is, I think, an important point, proposing a referendum when you believe in the constitutional change that it offers is one thing. Proposing, as David Cameron did, a referendum even though he opposed the change on offer is quite another thing. And to do so, not because of any public appetite, but simply to appease UKIP and the Eurosceptic voices in the Tory party was even worse. That was, in my view, reckless. Now, I also, in the early hours of the 24th of June, felt my share of the responsibility as a senior politician on the Remain side for the collective failure to convince a clear majority across the UK of the case for staying part of the EU, imperfect though it may be. So these were all the feelings I was experiencing in the early hours of the 24th of June. All of these feelings were, of course, tempered by a sense of pride in Scotland and in how Scotland had voted. More than 60% of those who had voted, and a majority in every single one of our 32 local authority areas, had said clearly that they wanted Scotland to stay in the EU. So as I started at around about 4 o'clock that morning to write the statement that I would later deliver in Bute House, there were several thoughts crystallising in my mind. Firstly, it seemed abundantly clear to me that people, even many people who had voted Leave, were going to wake up feeling very anxious and very uncertain. It was therefore the job of politicians not to pretend somehow that we instantly had all the answers, but to give a sense of direction, to try to create some order out of the chaos. That's what I was determined to try to do for Scotland, and I assumed that UK politicians would do likewise. It turned out I was wrong about that. Indeed, the absence of any leadership and the lack of any advanced planning, both from the politicians who proposed the referendum and from those who'd campaigned for a Leave vote, surely must count as one of the most shameful abdications of responsibility in modern political history. Second, although it was clear that the result would impact on all of our lives, it seemed obvious, even in those early hours, that the anxiety it would cause would be felt more immediately and more acutely by one particular group of society, nationals of other EU member states who'd chosen to make their homes here in the UK. I felt then, and I still feel very strongly today, that we must give them as much reassurance as possible. And I believe it's wrong that the UK government has not yet given a guarantee of continued residence to those who've built their lives, their careers and their families here in the UK. And thirdly, given how Scotland voted, and given the consequences for our economy, our society and our culture of being removed from the EU, I felt strongly then, and still do, that my job as First Minister is to explore every option to protect Scotland's interests. And that last point, protecting Scotland's interests, is the one I will dwell on today. I'll look at what Scotland's interests are and at how the Scottish Government will seek to protect them in the period ahead. Before I do that, though, let me just briefly touch on one other thought that was in my mind then and that has developed and strengthened since, and that's the need to learn the lessons of this referendum, both of the campaign and of the result. The lessons of the campaign will no doubt be talked about by politicians and by political commentators for many years to come. Some of them were the subject of advance warnings to David Cameron, warnings that I suspect he now wishes he'd listened to a bit more carefully. Now, I don't have time to discuss these in detail, but they are important, and there are three in particular that I just want to mention briefly in passing. First, the limitations and the dangers of negative fear-based campaigning, particularly in the social media age, where people have access to information from all sorts of different sources. Secondly, the need to understand that campaigns are not year zero affairs. You tend to reap in campaigns what you've sown over many years. It shouldn't have come as a surprise to politicians who have spent years and years and years denigrating the EU and pandering to the myths about free movement of people, that some voters simply did not believe them when they suddenly started to extol the virtues of both. And thirdly, the mistake of excluding certain groups of the population from the vote. I think it was wrong in principle to deny EU nationals and 16 and 17-year-olds the right to vote. But as well as being wrong in principle, it was also tactically foolish. These were precisely the groups in our population that were most likely to be positive about the European Union. So there's no doubt that mistakes were made. As I say, there'll be plenty of time in the months and the years ahead for all of us to mull over the lessons of the campaign. What is perhaps more urgent and certainly more important is that we learn the lessons of the result. And to do that, we must make sure that we properly understand it. Leave campaigners may have played the anti-immigration card to the point at times of overt racism, and they did. But 17 million Leave voters were not racist. Not even in many cases were they anti-immigration. So why, in spite of all of the warnings about the economic and financial consequences that would follow, did they choose to vote to leave the European Union? That's a question that we must address. It might take us some time to do it, but we must start now. And let me be clear about this. It's important to ask and to answer that question here in Scotland as well. The country may have voted overwhelmingly to remain, but 1 million of us across Scotland voted to leave, and we mustn't lose sight of that. As First Minister, I have a duty to understand and respond to the concerns that lay behind those votes. Now, academic theses will be written on this subject for years to come, and I'm a politician, I'm not a doctor of philosophy, so what follows now are just my observations. I don't doubt that many people voted leave simply and straightforwardly because of what they think about the European Union. The EU is not perfect, far from it. Its institutions too often seem remote and its regulations unnecessary and interfering. And of course, as I said earlier, UK politicians have spent years blaming it for all our ills and denying any of its achievements. So it's hardly surprising that many took the opportunity when it was offered to them to vote against it. But for many people, I suspect the real roots of their Leave vote lay much, much closer to home. The referendum was a chance for many to send a message, consciously or unconsciously, about how they're governed and the effect that government policies have on their day-to-day lives. This vote was about Europe, yes, of course it was, but in my view it also reflected a serious loss of confidence and trust in UK institutions, institutions that have become remote and detached from people's lives. Now, we shouldn't be complacent here in Scotland, but perhaps there is at least a partial explanation to be found for the different result here in the statistics measuring trust in the Scottish and UK governments. Ever since devolution, people in Scotland have trusted Scottish governments more than UK governments to act in Scotland's interests. And that, incidentally, has been true under all of Scotland's governments since 1999, so it's not a party political point that I'm making. But it is worth pointing out that trust in the Scottish Government to act in Scotland's long-term interests is higher today than it has been at any time since the establishment of the Scottish Parliament, and it is more than 3 times higher than trust in the UK Government to act in our long-term interests. So trust in institutions, or lack of it to be more precise, is in my view a factor in the result of the referendum. But a bigger factor, a much bigger factor, is policy. There's little doubt in my mind that many voted to leave the EU, voted against the status quo, in other words, out of a feeling that they were being left behind. Mariana Mazzucato, a member of my Council of Economic Advisers, has said, rightly I think, that many Leave voters were protesting about the effects of austerity and an economic system that simply doesn't work for them. However, she also said that, and I'm quoting her now, if the Leave campaigners were right about how many felt about life and work in Britain today, they were wrong about the causes and wrong about the solutions. Blaming the EU was a category error. In truth, the blame lies closer to home. And that, I think, is the hard truth. Much of the blame for what happened on the 23rd of June lies with the UK government's ideological obsession with austerity, with its decision to make ordinary people pay the price of a financial crash that they didn't cause, and also with its cynical collusion in the myth that cuts in public service pressures are the fault of migrants, rather than a direct result of deliberate government economic policy. So this referendum result, if the right lessons are being learned, must put tackling inequality and democratic renewal at the very top of the political agenda. A good start, though, I have to say I'm saying this more in hope than expectation at this stage, but a good start would be for the new Prime Minister and Chancellor to abandon completely the austerity economics pursued by their predecessors. So those are my reflections 1 month on, looking back the way. But the present and the future, of course, matter much more than the past. However much we might like to, we can't turn the clock back. So how do things stand today, 1 month on? Well, firstly and most obviously, we have a new Prime Minister and a new UK government. But we don't yet have any clear explanation of what a leave vote means in practice. If we can read anything from the early signs, whether from government appointments or initial pronouncements, it is, though I hope I'm wrong about this, that the UK is heading towards a hard rather than a soft Brexit, a future outside the single market with only limited access and significant restrictions on free movement. But while Brexit means Brexit is intended to sound like a strong statement of intent, it is in truth just a soundbite that masks a lack of any clear sense of direction. There is also today, I think, something of a calm before the storm. The initial shock that everybody felt in the days after the result might have worn off, but we don't have to look far at all for warning signs of what is to come. Last week, the IMF cut its growth forecast for the UK by almost half. And on Friday, the Purchasing Managers Survey, in recent years a very strong indicator of GDP growth or indeed GDP contraction, plunged heavily into negative territory. And these are just two of the plethora of warnings that we've had in recent days about what lies ahead economically. Now, at a time when we were already dealing with real fragility in our economy as a result of global trends, and here at home the impact of the oil price, this is very, very bad news indeed. It will impact on jobs, investment, living standards, indeed on public services and public spending. Will a UK government facing shrinking tax revenues be willing even to protect the funding that currently comes from the EU, let alone deliver the increased NHS spending that the Leave campaign so dishonestly promised? I think that at the very least is an open question. Of course, the impacts will not just be economic. Already there is evidence, initially anecdotal evidence, but becoming firmer with every day that passes, of UK and Scottish universities being shut out of research partnerships. So it's against this backdrop that I am so determined to do everything I can to protect Scotland's interests. And let me turn now to what those interests are and why they really matter. One of the important points I want to make today is this one. Protecting our place in and our relationship with the EU is not just some article of faith. It is about our vital interests. It really matters to the lives of people right across our country. Now, firstly, of course, there is our democratic interest. To put it simply, we didn't vote to leave in Scotland. We voted to remain. And to be told that we have to leave regardless would be tantamount to being told that our voice as a nation doesn't matter. Of course, some will say that we also voted to stay in the UK, so we must accept the UK-wide verdict. But in 2014, we voted to stay part of a UK that was a member of the European Union. Indeed, we were told back then that protecting our EU membership was actually one of the main reasons to vote against independence. So our democratic interest is, in my view, a very strong one. Does our voice count? Does it matter? Is it heard? But it's not the only interest at stake. Perhaps it's not even the most important one. There's also our economic interest. For a country that sends almost half of our international exports to other EU countries, retaining membership of a single market of 500 million people matters. For a nation that has a strong financial services sector, the system referred to as passporting matters. With a significant rural economy, retaining access to cap payments matters. With a reputation earned over generations, centuries indeed, for punching above our weight in research, ensuring access to competitive research funding and the global collaborations that flow from that matters. And for a country that needs to grow its population to help address skills gaps and deal with an ageing population, free movement of people really matters. All of that is now at risk, and it will be people who pay the price of this in real life if jobs, investment and living standards suffer as a result. Then there's our interest in social protection. The EU guarantees core rights and protections for workers, the right to paid holidays and maternity leave, limits to working hours, the right not to be discriminated against, health and safety protections. They all matter to workers the length and breadth of our country. And I genuinely fear that a UK government outside the single market will seek economic competitiveness through deregulation and a race to the bottom. And if that happens, that would be devastating for the workers' rights and the protections that we in this country have come to take for granted. We also have an interest in solidarity, in independent countries coming together for mutual protection against the threats of crime and terrorism and working together to address big global challenges. The European arrest warrant, intelligence sharing, the cross-border enforcement of civil rights, collective action to tackle climate change, initiatives like Erasmus that give our young people the chance to study in other countries and deepen their understanding of different cultures. All of these matter. All of these really matter to our collective peace and security, to the very future of our planet. And lastly, it is, in my view, in our interest to have influence, to end up in a position which is highly possible, where we have to abide by all the rules of the single market and pay to be part of it or to have access to it, but have no say whatsoever in the rules that govern the single market. That would not be taking back control, to coin a phrase that we've heard once or twice recently. That would be giving up control. Having an influence in shaping the world we live in matters, and it matters for all of us. So democracy, economic prosperity, social protection, solidarity and influence, these are the vital interests that are at stake in this. These are the vital interests that we must now seek to safeguard. They're not abstract, they are real, and they matter to every individual, every business across our country. So what then are our options? Well, simply and in summary, we can seek to find or create a solution that enables Scotland's distinctive voice to be heard and those interests to be protected within the UK, or we can consider again the option of independence. Now, I said the morning after the referendum, and I repeat again today, that at this stage we must keep all of our options open. That means exploring in the first instance, starting in this crucial period before the triggering of Article 50, as the UK government develops its negotiating position, options that would allow different parts of this multinational UK to pursue different outcomes. That means the nations that voted to leave can start figuring out what Brexit actually does mean, while others, like Scotland, can focus on how to retain ties and keep open channels that we do not want to close or dismantle. Now, let me say at the outset, and let me say it very, very bluntly, I don't underestimate the challenge of finding such a solution. Even if we can agree a position at UK level, we would face the task of persuading the EU to agree it. So the barriers are substantial. But to those who want to rule out the possibility of success before we even try, I would say two things. Firstly, and this is something of a cliche, but it is still true, we live in unprecedented times. When Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty was drafted, it was probably back then considered inconceivable that any country would ever vote to exercise. In fact, you only have to read Article 50 to know that it was never written with a view to any country seeking to exercise it. But that has now happened. And beyond those few lines of text, there are no rules for what happens next. The territory is uncharted, the page is blank. Now, that poses challenges, but it also gives us an opportunity to be innovative and creative, an opportunity to shape the future. And already ideas are being floated. Terms like reverse Greenland and the Norway model have already entered our lexicon, and a number of academics and experts have started to sketch out other more bespoke possibilities. Now, some of them may well prove impractical, some of them may well prove undesirable. But in a union where the relationships between our nations are constantly evolving, there's no black and white. So let's consider all of the options with an open mind and work to develop the right outcome for Scotland. The second point I would make to those, particularly in the UK government, who are at pains to say how highly they value the United Kingdom, is this. Now is the time to do more than just assert, against some considerable evidence to the contrary, that the union works for Scotland. It's surely now time to find ways to demonstrate that Scotland's voice can be heard, that our wishes can be accommodated and our interests protected within the UK. It seems to me that the UK government now has a responsibility, indeed it has a vested interest to do so. For our part, the Scottish Government has already started work, advised by the Standing Council of Experts that I appointed in the days following the referendum, to develop such options. I welcomed very much the Prime Minister's commitment in Edinburgh just over a week ago that different options that we bring forward will be considered and that Article 50 will not be triggered until there is agreement on an overall UK position. My government is now working with the UK government to establish exactly what these commitments mean in practice. We need now to set out in detail the manner in which the Scottish Government will be involved in the development of the UK position ahead of Article 50 being invoked and the mechanism for ensuring meaningful assessment of the options that we bring forward. And we must also be clear what our involvement and that of the other UK administrations and parliaments will be in the political decision to invoke Article 50, not just in the evidence gathering and consultation to inform that decision, but in the actual decision itself. And I know other administrations are equally anxious about that. Indeed, at the British Irish Council meeting in Cardiff on Friday, Carwyn Jones, the First Minister of Wales, put forward a suggestion about the involvement of all four parliaments across the UK being involved in that. So these are this is the work we are doing to turn the commitments that have been given into practical reality. I hope very much to be able to update the Scottish Parliament on the progress of these discussions and the implications of them for the organisation of the Scottish Government's work over the course of the summer. And as we do all of this, we'll also continue our engagement with Europe, with the institutions and with other member states to build understanding and support for Scotland's position. And I have to say the response we've had so far has been warm and it's been welcoming. I think there's many across Europe who see that it would also be in Europe's interests to allow those who don't want to sever their ties with Europe to find a way of not doing so. All of this, of course, brings me inevitably to the question of independence. Now, I'm not expecting to grab any headlines tomorrow morning with the statement I'm about to make. I'm a lifelong nationalist. But I also said in the immediate aftermath of the EU referendum that in seeking to chart a way forward for Scotland, independence wasn't my starting point. And that remains the case. Protecting Scotland's interests is my starting point, and I'm determined to explore all options to do that. But I'm equally clear about this. If we find that our interests can't be protected in a UK context, independence must be one of those options, and Scotland must have the right to consider that option. And that's why we will take the preparatory steps to ensure that it's an option open to the Scottish Parliament if the Scottish Parliament considers it necessary. Now, I don't pretend that the option of independence would be straightforward. It would bring its own challenges as well, I think, as many opportunities. But consider this. The UK that we voted to stay part of in 2014, a UK within the EU, is fundamentally changing. The outlook for the UK is uncertainty, upheaval, and unpredictability. In these circumstances, it may well be that the option that offers us the greatest certainty, stability, and the maximum control over our own destiny is that of independence. So, ladies and gentlemen, these are my brief reflections on the past month and my thoughts at this stage on the way forward for Scotland. Now, just as the past few weeks have been the most tumultuous in my memory, so too will the period ahead be difficult and uncertain. And standing here today, I don't claim to have a clear line of sight to the future, nor do I have all the answers to the many questions that we face. But what I do know is this: Scotland didn't choose to be in this situation. I also know that our vital interests are at stake with potential consequences that will affect all of us. So as your First Minister, I have a duty to do all I can to protect those interests and to do so as far as I can in a way that unites us as a country. That's what I'm determined to do as we seek to chart the best way forward together. Thank you very much for listening. I look forward now to answering your questions.
Okay, thank you very much, First Minister, for that contribution. We'll now move into Q&A. So hands up, please. There's some roving mics, so I'd appreciate it if you could wait until the mic comes and also explain who you are and where you're from. So questions, please. I think we'll come down the front here first. We'll take questions in threes as well.
Mark Majewski-Anderson from Glasgow Caledonian University, Director of the Europe Office. Nicola, I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned the anecdotal evidence of the problems with research funding and Erasmus as well. It would help a great deal if there was certainty over the continuation of the fund that's in place at the moment. It would be fantastic if you could persuade the Commission to confirm that in the British government, because that would immediately resolve the doubts that are existing. Thank you.
Okay, hands up for another one or two. Okay, just next.
Hi, I'm Niamh Webster. I work for an organisation called the Democratic Society. I'm wondering, you talked about if we've learned the right lessons. The referendum result puts the democratic renewal at the top of the agenda. I just wondering if you could tell us a bit more about that. Thank you.
Okay, and lastly for a third question. Great.
Ryan McQuigg from Oxfam, Scotland. First Minister said recently that she couldn't find strong enough words to talk about how wrong tax avoidance was. I was just wondering if the EU referendum vote, how that's going to play out at EU level for tax transparency, cooperation, and also at a domestic level. Is the First Minister angry and embarrassed that Scotland has sort of aided these tax deals via the Scottish limited partnership loophole, and what will the Scottish Government do to get the UK Government to close that loophole?
Okay, three questions. We'll try to stick to Scotland and Europe, but...
I'm happy to go where they take me within reason. Mark, your question is a really important one. We're pressing the UK Government just now to give as much certainty on as many issues as possible. We've done that since day one on EU nationals. We're doing likewise on research funding, on Erasmus, on funding streams like CAP and structural funds. We're not having huge success at the moment in getting to those positions of certainty. We may see statements in the days ahead. Obviously, around research, and the same is true of other funding, in theory, that remains in place as long as we are still in the EU, and it's important that we give statements to that effect to give as much reassurance as we can. And certainly with CAP and structural funding, that's true, and those are not competitive funds in the same way that research funding is. I think one of the issues we're hearing about in terms of research is, notwithstanding what the position in theory is, the unconscious or semi-conscious factors behind decisions are already kicking in. So UK researchers are being asked to step aside from leadership positions in collaborations, and perhaps decisions are already starting to be taken that carve the UK institutions out of these things. That's deeply worrying. We're working with the universities to try to give reassurance to the extent that we can, and we'll continue to do that. But your general point that as much guarantees and as much certainty on as many issues as possible is what we will continue to press both the UK Government and the European Commission to do. But in the current circumstances, with so much uncertainty around even where the UK is trying to end up, I don't want to underestimate the difficulties we'll face in trying to do that. Second question, sorry, I didn't catch your name. Thank you. Lessons for, I think democratic renewal is one of those lessons. I said I thought trust and a sense of detachment from institutions was a factor in the result. I think we've got lessons in Scotland. We're already seeking to take forward an agenda of community empowerment and devolving decision-making to local communities through our community empowerment legislation and some of the work we are now taking forward. I think that becomes all the more important. But without sounding complacent at all about Scotland, I think there's a big job of work to be done here. I do think there are more fundamental problems in other parts of the UK in terms of that distance and complete detachment between voters and the UK Westminster Parliament. And I think in many ways Westminster has had this coming for a long time, and it is now time to seriously address that. What the prospects of that are, I definitely don't want to go off in the tangent I'm about to risk going down. The prospects of that happening with the chaos in the Labour Party and all the rest of it just now, I wouldn't want to speculate about, but that is vitally important. So in Scotland we'll continue to try to take forward that work in the direction that we've already set out. And Ryan, in terms of the prospects for work around tax avoidance and transparency, I don't think the Brexit vote helps that in any way. What we want to see is countries working together to take away, as far as possible, the loopholes that often open up in different tax arrangements between different countries. I also, to amplify a point I made in my speech, one of the things that does really worry me right now is a UK outside the single market with all of the competitive disadvantages that's going to deliver to UK business will seek to compensate for that through deregulation and a sort of race to the bottom agenda. And I think that equally would open up rather than close down opportunities for tax avoidance and tax evasion. In terms of Scotland, I don't want to see us having loopholes in place that allow people to exploit in the way that we have seen. Where we have tax responsibilities in the Scottish Parliament, we're obviously taking on some more of those just now. We've put in place some of the toughest anti-tax avoidance arrangements anywhere in the world, and we would continue to encourage the UK government to do that. One of the problems, and I've said this many times before, is the UK tax code is so horrendously complicated that it is far too easy for people to find the holes in it, and there is a serious amount of work needed to simplify that and to close that. We'll contribute to that as much as possible, but the more different countries can work together to do it, the better.
Great. Okay, hands up for another round of questions. I'm going to go to general public to begin with. So if we can have those two in the middle row there. Yes, perfect.
Hello, morning First Minister. Andy Whitty from Colleges Scotland, represent all the colleges in Scotland. You mentioned about the skills gap with the risk with the going out of the lack of free movement of people. Also, there was news this morning around the skills gap that's been identified within the Scottish economy. So it was just some words, I suppose, of reassurance on what your thoughts and plans were going forward within to protect the Scottish economy as far as funding of skills through the college sector going forward.
Okay, and the person next.
Good morning, First Minister. Brian Buchan from Scottish Engineering. Our membership, which comprises everything from pharmaceuticals, whisky, heavy engineering, was emphatically in favour of staying within the Eurozone. 78% of our respondents said they wanted to remain within Europe. The issue that we have now is that the last month has been calamitous in terms of raw material cost for many of our manufacturers. Just as one example, zinc has gone up 28% in net cost to the people working with that in Scotland. We cannot afford prevarication that goes on for some 2 years while we mess about with Article 50 and vacation or whatever. We need action now.
And a third, just to complete the round, the person down here at the front.
Alistair Carmichael, Provost, East Redrishire. Would the First Minister agree with me that it would be advantageous for the City of London if Scotland was able to remain in Europe, insofar as even the cartoon in the FT on Saturday indicated a sports car heading to Scotland with money following it?
Great, thank you.
Okay, 3 good questions. Andy, we've got skills gaps, as you know, in certain sectors, and it's first and foremost our responsibility working within Scotland, within our own population that is already here to deal with those skills gaps, and we're investing heavily in our colleges sector and working with Skills Development Scotland to do that, particularly to focus on key sectors where there is a skills gap, digital skills being an obvious example, where we've also set up the academy in collaboration with industry. One of the big things I think we need to do to help deal with the skills gap, won't solve it completely, but it will help, is in those careers where girls and women are hugely underrepresented, is to get more of them to see those careers as attractive. So there's a lot of work we have to do regardless of the issue around freedom of movement. But there's no doubt that for a country like Scotland, and I don't want to diminish anybody's concerns about immigration. There are many parts of the UK where some of the impacts of immigration have been significant. And there's an area in my own constituency in Glasgow where recent Eastern European immigration has created some challenges. Incidentally, according to the ballot box sampling we did, that part of Glasgow voted heavily to stay within the European Union, which has got a message of its own. So I don't want to suggest that people's concerns about immigration are not valid or they don't need to be addressed. But Scotland is a country that has an imperative to grow our population. I mean, think back to the 2014 independence referendum. One of the things that was often thrown at the Yes campaign was that our population was projected to grow much more slowly than the population across the rest of the UK. So we couldn't, it was wrong, but this was the case that was made. We couldn't therefore cope with the burden of an ageing population. We've got a real need to grow our working age population. So to be in that position at the same time as free movement is being potentially choked off will exacerbate some of the challenges we've got in Scotland. Now, I don't think politicians have made that case strongly enough. I would say, in defence of my own party, we have tried to make that pro-migration case, but I think all politicians, instead of pandering to some of the myths about migration, have to make that case strongly. But it is one of the key interests of Scotland that is on the line at the moment, and it worries me greatly. Brian, you raise a point there that I think is a point that needs to be underlined in terms of, we hear a lot just now, and it's not that there's no truth in this, but it is oversimplifying. We hear a lot about the weaker pound is good for exporters. Well, many of our exporters rely on imported raw materials at the point you're making. So actually, that's not been the advantage. At best, it's balancing out. At worst, it will be making life more difficult for them. So some of these simplistic attempts to put silver linings on clouds do, I think, anger people when they know that the reality is very different. I agree with you about the urgency of this. I don't think a prolonged period of negotiation with the EU is in anybody's interest if there is uncertainty that comes with this. But I think as a result of where we are, that is an inevitability, that there's going to be a prolonged period of discussion and negotiation that will have, as part of that, a lot of uncertainty. So my job, and I can't wave a magic wand over this, but my job, as far as I can, is to try to bring, in a Scottish context, as much certainty about the direction of travel as possible, but also up our efforts even more to work with business in Scotland to try to deal with some of the challenges they're facing. Before the Brexit vote, just after the Scottish election, had appointed a new Economy Cabinet Secretary, and I've tasked Keith Brown with intensive engagement with business so that we can look at our own policy levers to see what more we can help businesses with in this particular circumstances. So that's my commitment, that very close relationship. I can't take away all of the certainty. I can try as much as possible to help us manage our way through it, and in a Scottish context, give as much of that as possible. And Alistair, I love sports cars with bootfuls of money to be heading to Scotland. Look, the City of London is important to Scotland given the importance of our financial services sector, and so it's in our interest to have a strong City of London, and it's in our interest to have a strong financial services sector here working very closely with that. So in a sense, those dual but interrelated interests are at risk. I was down speaking last week to a group of city voices talking about some of the challenges. Now, one of the great uncertainties is what the negotiations is going to mean for financial services. The passporting arrangements I refer to are hugely important. But in all of this, as we go along, my job now and in any arrangements and any circumstances that lie ahead is to make it very clear that Scotland is open for business and we're an attractive place to do business. And maybe, depending on how things unfold in the months ahead, will become an even more attractive place to do business. So we've got to be ready to take the opportunities from that.
Great. And one last round of questions. I think we will go to the back. So we'll take 2 questions from the press. So yes, great.
Nick Eardley from BBC Scotland. First Minister, are any or indeed all of the interests you've set out today non-negotiable red lines for the Scottish Government? And if they're not accepted, is the next move inevitably to call another independence referendum?
And Scott, thanks.
Yeah, First Minister, Scott McNabb from The Scotsman. You talked about the need to retain freedom of movement with Scotland and acknowledged this is actually likely to be heavily restricted in the rest of the UK. Does that inevitably lead to border checks, and would you see that as a price worth paying?
Okay, First Minister.
Okay. Well, Nick, that was an impressive attempt there to write your own headlines, I thought, with red lines and independence referendum being inevitable. So well done. I'm sorry that I'm going to try and deny you the opportunity to have those headlines. Look, I've set out very clearly what the interests are that I think are at stake in Scotland, and the interests now going forward that it's my duty to try to protect. I think I've set out very clearly that all options are on the table. As I said earlier on, I've spent my whole adult life making the case for independence, but I am open to seeing if we can find a way of protecting Scotland's interests within the UK. But if we can't do that, then of course Scotland has to have the option of considering independence. I think I said this actually the morning after the referendum. That's a statement of the obvious. I think Russell actually said something similar in his opening remarks. So all of these options have to be on the table. But my guiding principle will be what's in Scotland's best interests as we go through what will be an uncertain period ahead with no doubt lots of twists and turns. And what I've tried to do today is set out some of the benchmarks that will guide those decisions as we go forward. Scott, I don't want to see a border or border checks between Scotland and the rest of the UK. And interestingly, as I understand it, Theresa May is in Northern Ireland today, reassuring people in the north and the south of Ireland there'll be no border checks between North and Northern Ireland and the Republic. So, you know, if there is a way that can be found in the Irish context to avoid that, and we'll see what those ways turn out to be, then clearly, by definition, there would be ways to avoid that in a Scottish context as well. You know, I know there's lots of people want to frame, not you, Scott, but lots of other people who want to frame this as, you know, Scotland choosing to protect our interests and give effect to our voice means, you know, borders and choices between one single market or another. You know, we haven't asked to be in this position. We're in this position, so we've got to find the best way forward for Scotland. I want to continue the strong trading relationship we have with the rest of the UK and free movement with the rest of the UK, but I don't want to have to give up those benefits that we have with the wider single market of the EU. So my job is to try to navigate our way through this that gives the best possible outcome for Scotland and protects as far as we can our relationships within the British Isles and the rest of Europe. And as I say, I think much of what might happen and be discussed and hopefully be resolved in the Irish context will have lots of potential read across into Scotland as well.
That's great. Well, all that is left for me to do is to thank you ever so much for coming. I'm sure you'd agree with me that that's been a fascinating contribution from the First Minister today on the future of Scotland and Europe. And it's been a great privilege for IPPR and IPPR Scotland to have you all here and to hear from the First Minister. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. That was great. Thank you so much for doing that.